Welcome to CyberSoul, the podcast where we get real about the stories behind the scene, where cybersecurity, leadership, and humanity collide. I'm your host, Keelin Conant, and today we're diving into a part of the cyber crisis that doesn't get enough airtime: communication. Because a ransomware attack doesn't just hit your servers, it hits your brand, your team, and your customers' trust. Join me today is Cara Stewart, CEO of Wunder Marx and a powerhouse in crisis communications, persuasion, and reputation strategy. She's helped shape the narrative of dozens of high-growth companies in some of the most vulnerable moments. Cara, thank you for being here. I'm so glad you're here.
Keelan, thank you so much for having me. I'm really proud to be here for Wunder Marx.
So let's start here. Where did you go from journalist to founder of one of the boldest persuasion agencies out there? And how did cyber become part of your world?
Yeah, that's such a nice question. Thank you. I was a reporter with the Orange County Register, and as you can imagine, as a reporter, learned a lot about crisis communications. Of course, I was covering it, everything from the Orange County of Orange bankruptcies to some of the beginning stages of events like the Y2K incident and what that actually could be, and learned a lot from that and decided to then flip my hat and actually step on the other side of the table as a communications expert helping to shape organizational communications. And at the time, I ended up working for what became a Fortune 50 worldwide technology distribution company. And from there, went into a series of tech startups where I was responsible for not only shaping public perception, but handling the communications for customers, for supply chains, and of course for journalists. And any company over the past several decades has had to understand the risks relating to their digital footprint and cybersecurity and what it means, the ramifications for their customers' data and other data within their supply chain. So naturally, communications being really an executive function has always had, or should have always had, a seat at the table.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. So going back to the cyber part of it, why is crisis communication for cyber not just a PR bolt-on? Why does it deserve its own strategy?
Oh, sure. Well, if you think about it, cybersecurity is speaking to the heart of trust, and trust is a persuasion element. Um, if a company breaches a client's trust, whether it is cybersecurity or even a product failure, or simply does not do as they said that they're going to do in delivering a product or a service, communication comes into it. So we often have a seat at the table to be able to work with partners in three ways. One, we know something is going to happen. There are going to be cybersecurity incidents. So let's be proactive and make a plan for it. Two, during the incident, most companies are going to be heads down trying to resolve it, working with partners like yourself or their internal teams. Sometimes no one is managing the external communications, and it doesn't make sense to have that initial strike team try to do it. It really is something that should reside in the communications, sales, and marketing function, really those that are closest to the customers and closest to the industry and all the stakeholders. And then after the fact, while the technologists are figuring out and determining how to prevent that from happening, shoring up security, we go into trust rebuild mode to make sure that our community, customers, end users understand that this is unfortunately part and parcel of doing business in 2025 and beyond, but also that a company has taken steps to remediate, that they can rebuild trust, and that their security has been perhaps temporarily compromised, but to know that there is a plan in place to rebuild that trust.
Thank you for giving the whole overview and the outline. So let's go into a crisis timeline. What happens in the first 24 hours? In my understanding, The breach hits, what should leadership focus on? And then there's the internal communications, right? You talked about how to talk to our customers, but how do we talk to our employees? And then, the transparency versus liability. So I know that was a lot, and I'll guide you through each one. But that first 24 hours when the breach hits, what should leadership focus on first?
Yeah, definitely. There really is a lot to unpack because exactly as you said, there's so many stakeholders that can be affected from internal to external. And the most important critical part is not only within that first 24 hours, it's actually within the first 90 minutes. So we get to work immediately. Um, if you think about it in terms of triaging any emergency, the first priority is that internal coordination. So we need to make sure that leadership activates a crisis communications or a crisis response team. That has to include IT, it has to include legal, executive leadership, public relations, investor relations. The makeup of that's going to be a little bit different depending upon the company and its complexity, but those key players should be identified well in advance so when a crisis hit, they are ready to go. And they are the ones going to be responsible to understand the facts as it happened. What happened? What data has been affected, for example? What are the immediate actions that are going to be taken? And then communication gets to work with that coordinated team of drafting an initial holding statement to be able to communicate to all stakeholders, starting internally and radiating out to customers, again, investors, the media, supply chain partners. It's going to depend, that complexion's a little bit different depending on the type of company, but you get the idea of where it is. And that is all really to establish one authority of we are aware of what's happening, we are committed to being transparent with the situation, and we will continue to communicate with you, knowing that the absolute worst thing that can happen, even worse than the data breach, is that silence, because that spreads fear, misinformation, and you lose credibility, you lose trust. And those kind of vacuum and the absence of leadership is where rumors and fear spreads. Finally, you also want to lock down the internal messaging. So that is not to say we clamp down all communications, but you have to be able to brief employees in a way so that they're able to know what to communicate and when. That's critically important because oftentimes employees will inadvertently try to be helpful by over communicating. But if they're not in the know of what's absolutely happening, they can actually start to spread rumors that backfire on them, that cause worse damage, and that further erode that trust. So that really has to happen within the first 90 minutes.
That's great. And then, the erosion of trust and the rumors, that also can lead to litigation, right? So what about transparency versus liability?
That's always a fine line to be able to walk. And that's why I always go back to if you're thinking about this in real time, you're losing the game already. So, what we always advise companies to do is to run tabletop scenarios ahead of time, where you actually physically, if possible, gather all of those key players again, executive team, leader, head of sales, head of marketing, crisis communications, your whole team around you, and of course, with IT, to determine what are the possible types of breaches that could occur, who would be affected, what are the possible outcomes from them, how to solve this problem quickly as possible, and what to say for each type of scenario. This is a really intensive exercise, but documenting all of that can prevent that crisis, that the confusion that occurs at the moment of a breach or a data attack that happens.
How would you suggest, because I in almost all of the interviews that I've done, this topic comes up over and over again. It's prepare, 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 plan it out, run the tests. And, in a real world situation, I'm sure people are listening to this and saying, like, I don't even have time to eat lunch. So, how do you, suggest carving out time? Because these are important topics we're talking about. How do you suggest for your clients to carve out time to really, you know, create the preparedness that, is needed in case it happens?
It's true, anytime I'm measuring